Welcome to Module 2, Lesson 9. This lesson will cover the requirement to serve at least one whole grain-rich food item per day. The information is found in Chapter 2 of the CACFP Administrative Manual and will also reference a resource from the National CACFP Association entitled Identifying Whole Grain Rich, available in Module 2 under Additional Resources. You may want to open the Whole Grain Rich resources so you can follow along. One serving of the grain items offered per day must be whole grain rich. While one serving is required, a best practice is to serve 2 or more whole grain rich food items per day. If the only meal provided is a snack and no grain items are served, the requirement does not apply. The whole grain rich requirement does not pertain to infants. Whole grain rich means a food includes at least 50% whole grains, and the next 2 grain ingredients are creditable. Creditable grains include whole or enriched grain, bran, or germ. Enriched means vitamins and minerals have been added to replace some of the nutrients lost during processing. Thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, and iron must be included for a food to be labeled enriched. If the ingredients statement uses the word enriched or includes these nutrients, the item is enriched. Bran and germ are nutrient-rich parts of a whole grain kernel. They are not whole grains but can be ingredients in whole grain-rich foods. Any one of 6 different options may be used to identify if a food item is whole grain-rich. The 6 options are: the product label is labeled whole wheat and has a standard of identity issued by the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. The food is included on a state's WIC-approved whole grain food list. The product includes an FDA-approved whole grain health claim on the package. The food meets the Rule of 3. The item meets the whole grain rich criteria under the National School Lunch Program, or proper documentation from the manufacturer or a standardized recipe demonstrates that whole grains are the primary ingredient by weight. If a food item meets any one of the 6 criteria, it is considered to be whole grain rich. Each method will be discussed in detail. Method 1. Products labeled whole wheat that have a standard of identity issued by the FDA are considered whole grain rich. Only breads and pastas with these exact product names meet the FDA standard of identity to be considered whole grain rich. Method 2. All products found on a state agency's WIC-approved whole grain food list also meet the CACFP whole grain rich definition. Note, the whole grain food list is different than the WIC cereal list. The WIC cereal list includes products that are creditable on CACFP, but not necessarily whole grain rich. Method 3. Products that include an FDA-approved whole grain health claim on the product label may be considered whole grain rich. The FDA whole grain health claims are as follows: diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers. Or, diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in saturated fat and cholesterol may help reduce the risk of heart disease. A product must include at least half whole grain to qualify for either of these statements. Method 4 is the Rule of 3, a 3-step process using the ingredient label to identify products that are whole grain rich. The first ingredient, or second after water, must be a whole grain, and the next 2 grain ingredients must be whole or enriched grains, bran, or germ. Grain derivatives are generally present in only small amounts and may be disregarded. Examples of grain derivatives are listed in the Whole Grain Rich resource. Any grain ingredients that are labeled 2% or less are considered insignificant and may also be disregarded. When applying the Rule of 3 to the grain portion of mixed dishes such as pizza crusts and burritos, the first grain ingredient must be whole grain, and the next 2 grain ingredients, if any, must be whole grains, enriched grains, bran, or germ. When applying the rule of 3 to ready-to-eat breakfast cereals, if the first grain ingredient is a whole grain and the cereal is fortified, the product meets the whole grain rich criteria. In this situation, the second and third grain ingredients, if any, do not need to be considered. A whole grain must be listed as the first grain ingredient and may be the second or third grain ingredient. Whole grains include any whole grains such as whole wheat, whole corn, whole barley, and whole rye. Look for the word whole followed by the name of a grain. It is helpful to refer to a list of items identified as whole grains when using the rule of 3. Some ingredients are also whole grains even though the word whole is not used. Examples include brown and wild rice, all types of oatmeal and rolled oats, bulgur, quinoa, millet, triticale, teff, amaranth, buckwheat, sorghum, grain berries or groats, and graham flour. The following ingredients are not whole grains: wheat flour, cornmeal, degermed cornmeal, bromated flour, organic wheat, farina, durum flour, bran, pearl barley, germ, long grain white rice, and unbleached flour. Do not use the color of a product to identify if it is whole grain rich. Food coloring may be added to make a food appear to contain whole grain when it contains little or none. Method 5. The food meets the whole grain rich criteria under the National School Lunch Program, or NSLP. Use of the NSLP whole grain rich criteria may ease menu planning and purchasing for schools that operate CACFP at-risk after-school programs or CACFP child care programs, as they can use the same whole grain rich criteria for both programs. The NSLP guide shown here can be used to identify CACFP creditable whole grain rich products. The NSLP whole grain rich criteria apply to all grain products with the exception of grain-based desserts, which are not creditable under CACFP. Examples of grain-based desserts include cookies, cakes, and brownies, breakfast bars, cereal bars, and granola bars, donuts and sweet rolls, pie crust used to make sweet pies, and toaster pastries. Method 6. If a whole grain is not listed first, but whole grains are included on the ingredient label, a manufacturer's statement is needed to document that the combined weight of all whole grains in the item is at least 50% of the total weight of all the grains in the product. Homemade whole grain rich items must be documented with a recipe showing the combined weight of all whole grains is at least 50% of the total weight of all grains in the recipe. Let's look at a few examples and determine if the items meet the criteria to be considered whole grain rich. In this example, the first 3 products are labeled whole wheat and meet the FDA standard of identity. The first product is a whole wheat macaroni. The second product is whole wheat bread, and the third is whole wheat buns. The last product shown is not labeled whole wheat and does not meet the standard. The next 3 products meet the rule of 3. The first product lists white quinoa as the first ingredient. Red and black quinoa are the second and third ingredients. All types of quinoa are whole grains, so all ingredients are whole grains, and the product is considered whole grain rich. The second product lists whole wheat flour, a whole grain, as the first ingredient. The next 2 ingredients are enriched bleached flour and wheat germ, both of which are creditable grains. Therefore, the product is considered whole grain rich based on the rule of 3. The third product lists whole grain wheat flour, a whole grain, as the first ingredient. The second and only other grain ingredient is cornstarch. Cornstarch is a grain derivative and may be disregarded. There are no other grain ingredients, so the product meets the rule of 3 to be considered whole grain rich. The last product lists organic whole wheat flour, a whole grain, as the first ingredient. Organic wheat flour is the second ingredient. Organic wheat flour is not enriched, so is therefore not creditable. There are no other grain ingredients in the product, Since the second grain ingredient is not creditable, the item does not meet the rule of 3 and the food is not considered to be whole grain rich. The next example includes cereals. The first 3 products list a whole grain as the first ingredient and include added vitamins and minerals on the ingredient label, which means they are fortified. Since any second and third grain ingredients can be disregarded, all 3 cereals are whole grain rich. The last example shows a cereal listing whole grain oats as the first ingredient. The product is not fortified with added vitamins and minerals. The second grain ingredient is rice, which is not enriched. Because the product is not fortified and the second ingredient is not enriched, the item cannot be considered whole grain rich. The next example is oat bread. It lists unbleached enriched flour as the first grain ingredient and also includes whole wheat flour and whole oats. A product formulation statement is required to determine if the combined weight of the whole wheat flour and rolled oats is more than or equal to the weight of the enriched flour. In this ravioli example, whole wheat flour is the first grain ingredient. The only other grain ingredient is enriched flour. The product can be considered whole grain rich. However, to credit the product, a product formulation statement is still needed to define the serving size and the product's contribution toward the meat alternate, and grain requirements. This is an example of a product formulation statement for Old El Paso Fold and Go Chipotle Chicken from General Mills. The statement says the product meets the whole grain rich criteria and provides 2 grain servings per 4.37 ounce serving. The statement is signed and meets requirements to identify the serving size, component contribution, and whole grain rich criteria. Product formulation statements are covered in more detail in Lesson 14. In order to document that at least one whole grain rich item is served per day, label whole grain rich foods on menus with the letters WG next to the food item. Indicate with a check mark the whole grain rich item on food production records. Since products frequently change, be sure to check labels each time items are purchased to verify they meet requirements. Keep the labels on file with the date served or purchased. This concludes the lesson on serving whole grain rich foods. If you have questions, please contact your CACFP consultant or the state agency. Contact information can be found in the front of the manual.